Great. Good evening, everyone. I am Adrian Mertens, Marin Water's Communications and Public Affairs Manager. Thank you so much for taking time to join Marin Water tonight. This is the first of our planned series of community workshops for the Water Supply Strategic Assessment. And just a couple housekeeping items. As members of the public join this Zoom meeting, you will be participating as an attendee, and so your microphone will be muted and your camera will also be turned off. Only today's panelists will be viewed during the meeting. And we will start with a presentation, and I'll have our general manager in just a moment do some introductions and go through that meeting agenda. But we will start with a presentation, and once that concludes, we will move to question and answer portion of the agenda, where attendees will have the opportunity to ask questions directly of our panelists or provide any comments on the information covered this evening. And when we get to that point in the agenda, I'll explain the process for raising your hand and speaking. And so with that, I will turn it over to our general manager, Ben Hornstein.
Good evening. I wanted to first thank everyone for those that have made the time tonight to attend and participate. And I say participate because we are very much looking forward to questions and comments and responding or taking those in as we go forward and develop this project. I realize everyone's busy, so our intention, and we're striving to make this worth your time tonight. The design tonight is to provide our customers, an overview of this project, as Adrian said, the Strategic Water Supply Assessment. And so tonight will be a bit high level to talk about the process, the schedule, the scope, the approach we plan to take in this project, the schedule, and a bit of background, but then really open it up for questions or comments. Do you see anything missing in our approach? Things that would benefit the project going forward if we miss some things, and all questions are good. You'll be hearing tonight from a few folks, Paul Celia, who's our Water Resources Director, Lucy Croy, our Water Quality Manager, Armin Munavar, who is from Jacobs Engineering and is a project manager helping us with this effort, and Adrian Mertens, who's our communications manager. Just backing up a little bit of what brought us here, as most of you are probably aware, in the midst of the drought emergency, we began the planning and then led to the design of an intertie with the East Bay to bring in supplemental water in context of the emergency we were in. We benefited from the October rains and more so even in December. And it gave us the opportunity to, take a more deliberate approach on the intertie with a full EIR that our board felt would be the responsible way to go, given the circumstances, how they changed. And also to do this project, which is taking a look at the likely contenders for what the best long-term water supply project would be to augment our supply in times of shortage and times of drought. This is going to be a 4-month, 5-month project. The only way we're able to do a project like this in this time frame is benefiting from the years of work that the district has done on really all of these efforts. So this is an effort to bring them together, to compile them, to bring costs up to current date, integrate the newest technologies, and ultimately develop a roadmap for implementation for staff under board direction to implement a direction under a roadmap to supplement our water supply for times of shortage. So as I noted, and I'll stop here, thank you again for participating, and we really do look forward to the questions that will come after maybe a 30-40-minute presentation that we'll go through. So with that, I'll hand it over to Paul Celia.
Thanks, Ben. Good evening. As Ben said, Paul Celia, Water Resources Director. In tonight's presentation, we'll go over background to provide some context for what we're talking about in terms of water supply, followed by a project overview where we'll get into a brief description of what we're planning, and a little more detail about the process and the assessment that we're going to be engaged in. And then throughout this project, a key emphasis will be on public engagement. We hope to bring you all along with us as we develop our supply assessment. And before we move on, I do want to note that this evening you're going to hear a lot about water supply projects. And I want to note that we haven't forgotten that there are two sides to that equation. There is a demand management or conservation side that we won't be delving into tonight. And in fact, it's of importance to us that we'll have a separate series of webinars dedicated to that subject. So while conservation and demand management will certainly be a key consideration in this water supply assessment, specifically tonight we'll be focusing more on the supply side. So if we go to the next slide, Lucy. Again, to provide some context, the district is about 147 square mile area that we serve. There are 190,000 or so people. We have a number of resources, fairly complex system, 7 reservoirs, a couple of treatment plants, hundreds of tanks, and almost as many pump stations. So it's a fairly complex district to operate. We are, I think, the oldest municipal water district in California, formed in 1912, with the designation that we are Special District number 1 in California. And what that means is we're pretty old, and in fact have records going back about 144 years. As we look at those records, I was just noting that since 1900 to 2000, there were 3 multi-year droughts that we can identify pretty clearly through our records: 29 through 34, 76 through 77, and 86 through 92. Already this century, we can look at 2 multi-year droughts. And it's a similar story when we look at our temperature record. Since 1900, the last 7 years have been notably warmer than the average. So these signals of climate change are really, usually measured over millennia, but we're starting to be able to detect them even in the fairly short 100-year time frame of our records. Yet, despite that climate change, the district has never failed to meet its primary mission of supplying high-quality drinking water to our customers. And part of that is due to the actions the district has taken, particularly after the 76-77 drought, where we expanded storage, doubling the size of Kent, building Sulahuly, and securing water contracts with Sonoma. So those supply-sided projects have really benefited us, and in particular in the last 2 years, which have been historically dry. If we go to the next slide. Those severe conditions that we encountered starting in sort of January of 2020 really threatened our water supply. As we look at the chart on the right, the projected lines where we were in June of 2021, we were looking at needing a supplemental source of water in the second half of 2022. And as Ben mentioned in his intro, that was the emergency intertie project that we focused on, and we're going great guns for. until, if we go to the next slide, Lucy, the October rains arrived. And between October and the end of December or early January, almost 50,000 acre feet of water was added to the reservoir system. This is not, by the way, an unusual phenomenon for the water district. Over the years, maybe unusual in terms of the months that it occurred, but over the years, this type of very heavy rainfall and runoff have occurred fairly frequently. In this case, that happenstance has allowed us to step back from the emergency that we were, everyone was manning every oar and paddling as fast as they could towards the emergency intertie and completing that project. The next slide, Lisa. So we have a little bit more time with the water supply that we now have, and that's going to allow us to undertake the strategic water supply assessment that you're going to hear a little bit more of in the rest of the presentation this evening. The result of the assessment will be a roadmap towards water supply resiliency. And Lucy's going to give us a brief overview of the project.
Thank you, Paul. So as mentioned, I'm Lucy Croy, the Water Quality Manager, and I'll be the project manager for the district on this project. So tying into, as Paul mentioned, the water supply assessment will be really focused on developing a roadmap, a water supply roadmap for implementation. And much of the work that will be part of this assessment is additive. So building off the previous planning efforts that have been conducted over the years by the district, and filling in the gaps and moving this forward on those water supply alternatives, and conducting a comparative analysis. So taking those alternatives and doing a comparative analysis of the options to really build the foundation of this roadmap moving forward, and do it in a strategic way so that we can move forward pretty rapidly using that 2-year kind of time frame that Paul noted, given the rains that we had in October. And much of the pace of this is really in response to the accelerated climate change that we've seen over the last 5 years, and how it's been impacting water supply across the state. So there's a few foundational questions that we've really built the scope of the work for this project on, and really where we see the assessment will address coming over the next few months, and really getting to the core of the work that will be done. So assessing really what is the current risk to Marin Water's water delivery, so our water supply under the recent drought, and then also future droughts. And really how much additional water supply is needed under those future drought and demand scenarios. So how much water would really get us farther along? And then on the other hand, what are the supply alternatives that we have available to us to increase the resiliency of our system? And going through and noting what are their strengths and weaknesses to really do that comparative analysis. And from that's really where we expect that we can, find the best investment in drought resiliency and develop those recommendations. So moving forward, I'm going to hand off to Armin Munavar, the lead technologist for Jacobs, and he is going to go into more detail. I've kind of given just a brief overview of what the project is intended to focus on, and he's going to go into more detail on how we're going to go about it.
Thank you, Lucy. Good evening, everyone. Like Lucy mentioned, I'm Armin Munavar, and I'm the project manager and kind of leading the water supply integration piece for Jacobs to support Marin Water. I'm joined with Marcelo Reginato and Laura Harnish, who are also on the line with Jacobs Engineering. So what I wanted to do is provide a brief overview, a kind of high-level overview of how we expect to conduct the work. And I'd like to start off with just kind of what the overall scope, the major elements of the scope of work. And Lucy, there's an animation here, so if you could, yeah, thank you. So the overall scope is kind of based on 3 main elements: kind of understanding the current risk and establishing goals. So we have three blocks of work that are intended to help us get to that point. First is about kind of confirming what is the the water supply strategy, the big picture strategy. What are our guiding principles? What goals do we want to establish? There is a decision support model that will be developed, which will help us on some of the analytical pieces to actually quantify the current risk and the future opportunities. And then developing water supply and water demand scenarios. So really looking at the future, both historical droughts as well as future potential droughts. How does that manifest itself? I think Paul mentioned it quite well. Most of our current droughts are now on the backdrop of an excessively warm period. In fact, we've looked at the last 150 years of record, and all of the current droughts since 2000 are on top of this anomalously warm period. So we want to characterize scenarios that really stress test the system and help us really understand what the risks are. The next block of work is, okay, well, the first block was about what is the current vulnerabilities and risk. The next piece is how do we identify and evaluate alternatives? So what could be developed to reduce that risk, to enhance resiliency to the system. We'll be conducting kind of two phases, one where we develop water supply alternatives, and then the second part about evaluating those alternatives across a range of criteria. And then finally, taking that information and really developing a strategic roadmap around it, which is not just the pros and cons list of various alternatives, but also triggers and elements on how and when certain actions should be implemented given the trajectory that we might be on. So I'd like to kind of dive into a little bit more detail on a couple of the elements. The first is this element, a task about confirming water supply strategy and goals. So really this is an upfront task we're embarking on here just next week to articulate the district's long-term water supply strategy and goals, and then take those specific goals and start to attach measures of performance associated with them. So are we looking at certain drought storage? For how long is that drought storage necessary? What are the guiding principles that we might want to use in terms of developing the strategies that enhance the ability for drought resilience? And really the goals are really an important way to communicate the process and the outcomes of this strategic assessment. The second major element I wanted to talk about is the decision support model. So the decision support model is really a regional and local system model that we'll be looking at to evaluate water supply resiliency. So we're bringing the best of kind of two modeling efforts together. There's been a long range effort over the past year and a half on the regional water supply resiliency study, of which Marin Water is a participant in. And that is supported with a regional model that covers most of the Russian River system and the Sonoma Water transmission system. And then we're bringing the Marin Municipal District model together with that model to make sure we can make informed assessments of not just Marin's potential opportunities, but how they interrelate with the regional system. These models incorporate the system infrastructure, the hydrology, the demands. They allow us to play out scenarios of new droughts, future droughts, historic droughts, changing demands, and identifying the risk and the vulnerability to the system associated with that. And then finally, the models will be used to help analyze the alternatives, but also may suggest areas for improvements where we might adapt the alternatives because of the results of the model. The next major element, if we can advance the slide, is looking at water supply and demand scenarios. So we like to use this graphic to kind of describe the future uncertainty, this cone of uncertainty. So really just the graphic is trying to illustrate that all we really know at this point is where we are today and what has happened in the past. And we have lots of projections of the future. And what we're attempting to do is explore different futures, droughts, demands, policies, et cetera, and ensure that the system is resilient given those plausible futures. We're not trying to predict one particular outcome. We want to look for robust solutions across the range of those futures. So our scenarios will incorporate water supply and water demand conditions. They'll look at historical droughts, climate projections, paleo reconstructions. And what we've done recently is develop some stress tests, which are a little bit synthetic droughts, but they allow us to really stress test the system. So for example, we've taken the 2020-21 drought and then put 1976 and 1977 on the backside of that. So to really look at a 3 or 4 year drought period. The water supply assessment process consists of considering a broad range of water management alternatives. So alternatives that increase supply, like Paul mentioned, demand management. Some alternatives may modify operations, and some may include policy and governance considerations. We'll look through a screening process there to look at the most promising alternatives, and then applying performance and environmental, economic, and social attributes. We'll be able to characterize each of those alternatives. What we may find is that some of the alternatives work best in combination with other alternatives. So there's likely a process where we'll develop portfolios of combinations of alternatives. And all of that process is really targeted to inform a strategic roadmap. And that's the outcome we want to achieve through this process, where we have actually specific projects, we have pathways, and we have triggers in which certain pathways should be explored more fully. Okay, and then finally, while the list will be quite broad initially, we know that we'll at a minimum be exploring these types of water management strategies. We'll have a baseline condition, which is looking at kind of today's system and with planned improvements. We'll be building in water shortage contingency plan, drought conservation scenarios. We'll look at water purchases with conveyance through the East Bay intertie, desalination options in North Bay, Sonoma Water options, increasing local surface storage, and expanding recycled water. And I believe, if I'm right in the, oh no, one more slide before I hand off. Okay. Yeah, and our overall schedule for completing this work, as Ben mentioned earlier, is that it's a very compressed schedule. So we're here today at the public workshop #1. Through the course of March and April, we'll be working on the strategy, updating the model and the scenarios. Then through May, we'll be looking at the water supply alternatives. We'll come back to this public workshop setting and inform on the status and what we've learned. And then in June and July, we'll be looking at the alternatives evaluation and developing the roadmap and preparing a report. And then finally, we'll come back for a third workshop to report out on findings. And if I'm right now, then Lucy, it's back to you.
If I could just mention something, we did get a question from the audience on whether or not the slides would be made available after the presentation, and we will be posting these slides as well as the meeting recording on our website tomorrow, and I'll share more on where you can find that when we get to the community engagement section.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you, Armin. So to touch on a little bit more detail on the water supply alternatives that we'll be covering in this assessment. There's a broad range of water management alternatives that this assessment will be looking at and that we've looked at historically, and those will all be included in the initial analysis of this study. So covering from water reuse, as Armin touched on, to demand management and desal and Sonoma Water. So one first alternative that we'll be looking at is the opportunity to expand local storage. And the feasibility there is currently to do so. The last time that we increased any local storage was in around 1983 or so, when we raised Kent Dam. And so what we'll be doing in this assessment is looking at, what is the current opportunity to do so in our local area, as well as, what would the process be, both the regulatory and the environmental approvals that would be needed, as well as new water rights. So really understanding what would go into this water supply option and how does it compare to the other water supply options that we'll be evaluating in this assessment. Another option that we'll be looking at is Sonoma Water. So since 1976, we've imported water from Sonoma Water that's been supplemental to our local storage and has helped during years of drought. And so in this assessment, we'll be looking at ways to really maximize that import and opportunities to take advantage of maybe excess flow in the Russian River, and finding ways to look at dedicated conveyance from Russian River, as well as looking at groundwater well rehab up in the Sonoma County, or doing collaboration with other agencies, and aquifer storage and recovery as well. So looking at the opportunities that all have to involve with expanding our collaboration with Sonoma Water. And with desal, we'll be looking again at, what is the opportunity currently for a regional plant, and what would the costs and the intertie be and the partnerships look like for going forward with a regional plant as well as with a local desalination plant, one that would be owned and operated by Marine Water. Over the past year, we have looked at a temporary in response to the drought, but this would be looking at a local desalination plant as part of the water supply assessment and really evaluating it in comparison to the other options that we're talking about here tonight. Another alternative that will be kind of in this array will be looking at interties, and so looking at the options to either connect to the East Bay, as was evaluated pretty in depth in the fall during the drought. So the connection between the Marin East Bay across the Richmond-Sandoval Bridge, or possibly through the North Bay Aqueduct. And looking at, what are the facilities that are needed in order to go forward with that water supply option. So the construction of a pipeline and pumping facilities, and as well with that, the complexity that comes along with agreements and then finding the water that would go through those facilities to ensure that the intertie is used. Another option that we'll be looking at is water reuse, and this covers a few different options here in this category. So looking at recycled water, we currently have a recycled water. We have a recycled water system, distribution system in the Terra Linda area, and so we're looking at, how does that expanding that system in comparison to the other water supply options. Indirect potable reuse is another option. So looking at how highly treated water, wastewater would be pumped up through to say one of our reservoirs, so Kent Lake. So that's what indirect potable reuse is. Another option would be taking forward direct potable reuse. So highly treated wastewater and then fed directly to customers. But it's not regulated at this point. So understanding really what are the complexities that come with that, and how can we pursue that as a water supply option. And then there's another category that really captures kind of the other options out there to really maximize our water supply. And these are really technologies and innovative concepts that we've captured over the years. So fog capture, cloud seeding, watershed management, and ways of really maximizing what else is out there in order to maximize our water supply. And then last, we'll also be working in demand management into this water supply assessment. So really understanding how our long-term efforts in water use efficiency play into the water supply portfolio, as well as with these enhanced conservation programs and initiatives, such as the non-functional turf initiative that's moving forward currently. How does that play in with the rest of our water supply portfolio? And continuing to evaluate how leak detection, both on the customer side and on our district system side, how can that impact our overall water supply strategy? So now I'm going to hand off to Adrian Martins, our Communications and Public Affairs Officer. Officer.
Thanks, Lucy. Next slide, please. So as we continue through the assessment process over the next several months, we do want to make sure you are aware of how we plan to keep you informed on our efforts. And so first, I want to make sure you know that we have a project information website. The URL for that is posted on the slide. It's marinwater.org/water supply resiliency. And on this site, you'll be able to find information about the assessment, some of what was covered tonight, the project scope, as well as any updates that we're able to share throughout the process. Additionally, the materials from this evening, as I mentioned a little earlier, are going to be posted on that website, as well as the recording from this workshop. And again, just give me until tomorrow to get that published. It was mentioned earlier that we are planning for 2 more workshops throughout the assessment process. And one of those will be planned for the May-June timeline, and then the other within the July or August timeframe. And then one great way to stay in the know on the scheduling of those workshops, as well as other important district updates, is by signing up for our e-news service. And if you do so, you'll receive a monthly news e-blast in your email inbox. And you can sign up for that at marinwater.org/e-news. And that's also up there on the slide. And we'll also be getting out the word about the upcoming workshops in a variety of other formats as well. And then finally, I want to mention that the district's regular board of directors meetings are a really great way to stay engaged in what's happening in the district. Board meetings are every other Tuesday, beginning at 7 unless otherwise noticed. Our next board meeting is set for next week, Tuesday, March 15th. And if you're interested in receiving notifications to view the upcoming agendas for each meeting, once those are published, you can do so by subscribing for Marin Water or at marinwater.org/get-notifications. And that's the bottom bullet there, that URL. And again, that'll just let you know what's on the agenda for each upcoming meeting, and you'll receive that in your inbox. Next slide, please. And so with that, we're ready to move on to our question and answer portion of the meeting, so that all of you that are attending can ask your questions or share your comments on the information that was covered tonight. And so I'll go over just a few logistical housekeeping notes. If you have dialed in by phone, please press *9 to let us know that you've raised your hand to ask a question or provide comment. And if you're watching on a computer or from your smart device and would like to ask a question or offer your thoughts, you may do so by using the raise hand function in Zoom. You can also type a question in the chat box, and I will read those aloud so that they may be answered by our panelists so that everyone attending can hear the answer. And our Zoom host, Terry, will move one by one down the list of attendees with their hand raised to help with enabling your speaking permissions in Zoom. And I do notice that we have a question posted in the chat, so I'll go ahead and start with that one. First question here is, what's the water board's role in this process?
I guess I could, I don't know if Paul, you were going to go. Either of us could probably go with the same answer, that the water board doesn't have a direct role in this process. They're a partner in many ways on what we do. Whether there's grant funding opportunities, and we're working with them now on that, as if there's water quality concerns, fortunately, we don't really have those sorts of issues, but they get involved in that. So they're aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it, but no direct involvement.
All right, thank you. And Terry, do you want to go ahead and take a question from those that have raised hands?
Sure. Do you want me to leave the screen up?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the first 2 speakers I have are Ed Jamison and then Rick Adler. Mr. Jamison, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd just like to make sure that part of the outcome of this study will be a clear definition of whether desal can be shut down and restarted or not. In 2017, Santa Barbara started a plant saying they expect to be able to do that. They even quoted their shutdown, their idled costs over whatever period that might be each year. They didn't specify the shutdown costs or the restart costs. I think it's very important that everyone be aware of that. I'm certainly fascinated with the subject and frustrated that I don't have answers to those kinds of things. So if anybody's got that answer, or if you'd like to offer a contact I could get some info from, I'd appreciate that. Either way, that needs to be clearly delineated in the outcome of the study. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Jameson, I could just add to that, that we do have a leading expert on desalination on the Jacobs team, and they will be looking into exactly this for us, so we can get a tailored response to your area of interest there.
Okay,
Do you want to take more hands?
I'm sorry.
Do you want to take a couple more
Yes,
questions?
yes. Rick Adler, please. Go ahead, sir, you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate the presentation, the slides, very helpful. I believe that the two best options to concentrate time and money on that don't require the weather or other agencies or areas is the purifying the wastewater for drinking use, and the desalinization, but the desalinization is through not through the reverse osmosis, which is very expensive, very high pressure, very complicated method that, but through heating the water to steam and condensing the steam into pure water, which is a low tech, no moving parts, very reliable way to do it. And that doesn't involve pumping lots of double salted water back into the bay, which would be endless problems, environmental toxic problems. And both of these methods, or any method you use, require vast amounts of electric energy. And that's the one part that's missing completely from all these presentations, is a production of solar electricity to power any particular water solutions. And I believe that the Marin Water should get together with Marin Clean Energy and their producers and come up with a method to produce our own electricity locally, and so we don't have to rely on PG&E, which is very expensive, getting more expensive, and has to come from a long ways. And when you transmit electricity a long ways, you lose a lot of it. So you lose a lot of the power, becomes more expensive. So I suggest that Marin Water become its own solar power electricity producer locally, close to where you will do the water purification or the desalinization through the steam. And that can be done either on a few acres of watershed land that's covered, south facing hill that's covered the Scotch broom, could be devoted to producing a couple of gigawatts of solar electric power and a relatively short electric line to the water purification facility. Or it can be done by putting up solar panels on top of all the parking lots of all the shopping centers in the Green Bay area. Just like we have the solar electric panels above the parking lot of Redwood High School. And that would provide shade for the people parking their cars in the shopping centers, and protection from the rain when people park their cars in the shopping center. Plus, it would produce a lot of electricity. Now, this solar electricity will, if the Marin Water finances itself, it will pay for itself in a few years, and you will own the power producing and be able to make a profit off of it in later years. If you let one of the producers finance it, they will finance it and charge you till they make their profit back, and then you can own the facility and carry on with there. But that's the one part that's completely missing from the presentations is Marin Water should become its own local power producer. Another advantage is that PG&E will regularly have power outages during the fire season, which is getting to be all year round. And that way you can avoid the power shortages and have your own guaranteed power source. And the other advantage is that when you need the water production the most, you need the electricity the most, is when there's lots of sun in the summer. And so you can.
Mr. Adler, I think those are great suggestions regarding, when we get to the evaluation stage for the various alternatives. I think there's a number of criteria that we'll be looking at to assess those options. And some of these things that you're talking about in terms of sustainability and social impacts will be exactly the kinds of things we will be considering. So I wanted to thank you for your thoughts. If you have other subject matter thoughts to share with us, maybe we'll get back to you, but I do want to let others have an opportunity to ask their questions this evening.
Sure. So hopefully I'll see a slide next time about power.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. The next three speakers, Mike McGuire, Annie or John Christensen, and then John Leszczynski. Mr. McGuire, please. Go ahead, sir. I've unmuted you.
Okay, I intentionally wrote my question through the chat because I know I would probably drag on like Mr. Adler. But my issue really is there a project like this, a process like this at the state level? Seems like they're in worse shape than we are. And there's actually some national issues in food production because the water is not getting to the farmers in our San Joaquin Valley. And maybe we should be helping the state and making water for them because we're now in a much better situation than they are.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Mr. McGuire. In fact, there is a process, I think, that just was kicked off today by, I think it's Department of Water Resources, where they're asking for under the governor's direction, looking at what it would take for California to survive a 6-year drought. So they're going to be working on some research, and ultimately that'll end up in a white paper at some point for the state. I think your comments are notable that we are in a different position than the rest of the state, that our reservoirs are near full, but regrettably our reservoirs are nowhere nearly sized enough to help the rest of the state. But I appreciate your sentiments there.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire. Annie or John Christensen, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Annie. So I've got two things. One is I'm really curious, when you project the future, you don't mention the fact that the state of California has mandated that we have to increase Marin's housing by 14,000 units. And I know that's not all the water districts, it's probably 9,000 or something, but we've got a huge amount of housing increase that we are legally required to do. So I think this is really important to take into your future projections? And then the other question is, you guys have done so many studies, and I'm kind of wondering how I can find a record of those studies and what the costs were. Where would I go to find that information?
I believe answering, or Adrian, you can jump in too, I think. We have a page on our water supply on the website for our water supply projects. And I think you can find some resources there. Though I don't know that the cost of the studies is there in particular. If you find that the cost of the study is something that you need, please send me an email and I'll do my best to track that down. In terms of projections for water demand, as soon as we have indication from the various towns and cities where these 9,000 to 14,000 units are needed, we'll be in a position to estimate what that demand will be, and we'll do our best to factor that into our future projections.
Thank you.
Mr. Lashensky, please, you should be unmuted.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Actually, I just have two recommendations. One is, if anybody's going to start talking about, particularly on desal, they've got to get a handle. They got to get a hold of I think it was 2005 pilot plant report on the pilot plant that was set up, in San Rafael out there in the water. And it was a remarkable pilot study with a lot of issues that they addressed and a lot of recommendations and a lot of common sense stuff. I read it from cover to cover a while back. I got it sent to me by somebody else. I don't know if you guys should get that and pass that out to a lot of interested people, because that was a terrific study and it was very positive on desal. And being a chemical engineer, I really appreciated the detail that study went into. So I strongly recommend anybody who wants to opine on the subject of desalination is to get a copy of that study. That's a comment I want to make, number one. Number two, intertie projects in general. The one we have been thinking about is the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. But if we get to the point where we are thinking seriously about significant desal operations in the order of 15, 20, 25 million gallons per day, we need to have intertie projects where we might just send water to other parts of the bay instead of just getting water from the other parts of the bay. In other words, make the intertie systems to go both ways. Now, that's simpler said than done, but I can just imagine some of the issues. But we should be in a position, if we do this, to other people instead of taking water from other drought-stricken areas. Those are the 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next three speakers, Steve Isaacs, Bob, then Baron Hamill. Mr. Isaacs, you should be unmuted.
I am, I think.
Yes.
I posted this on chat, but I guess I'll be doing this verbally. What I wrote was clearly a 2-year water supply from Marin has been an acceptable strategy for the MMWD board, and that has been a disaster. What goal has the board given to Jacobs as a water supply target?
Yeah, I'll start with that, Paul. I don't want to, but I can't help react to the disaster term. This district has been successfully supplying safe, high quality, reliable water for over 100 years. So I really am not seeing the disaster. What I'm seeing is a district responding to the external change of climate change in a similar fashion as we did in the late 70s and early 80s when we had the record drought back then. In terms of the substance of your question, as Armin presented, the first part of this study will be exactly that, working with the board and communicating to our customers and broader community what our risks are in terms of the current supply, and under different drought scenarios, how much supplemental water, in addition to long-term conservation and demand management, would be prudent as we develop the roadmap to implement the strategy. So that is coming shortly as part of this effort. And I think we're all going to find it to be a very thoughtful and kind of robust effort that will really help inform us in context of the challenges we're facing today.
So excuse me, but with all due respect, the board's policy or lack of policy and lack of strategic plan has been a disaster. Asking us to have a 40% rationing this past year exemplifies the fact that it was a disaster. A good strategic policy would have put us in a position where even with the severe drought, we would have had enough supply, so we wouldn't have had to be asked to ration by 40%. So I'm sorry, I strongly disagree.
That's fine, Mr.
And
Isaacs.
it's not a disagreement, or it's not a criticism of the staff. I think the staff has done an exemplary job over the years in trying to get the board to agree to an additional supply. They just haven't been able to get that happen. Secondly, as far as the question, you really didn't answer the question. Has the board directed Jacobs to look at a number of years of supply?
I won't take the bait on the further on the sidebar, but what I'm trying to convey is specifically that this project is intended to do just that, to work with our board, to bring data, to bring the modeling that you heard from Armin, and develop a goal and a target in context of evaluating these water supply alternatives. So I think you will see that coming, and that will be key and foundational to this effort going forward.
Yes or no? Did the board give Jacobs a directive on how many years of supply?
I think you heard my response. Thank you.
Okay, let's take the next question, Terry.
Yeah, definitely. Steve Isaacs, you should be unmuted, sir.
That was me.
Oh, that was you. I apologize.
Yeah.
That was you. Okay, Bob. Bob, you should be unmuted.
Hi, thank you. I also typed in my questions and comments through the chat. I'll read them back. Can you assure us that the alternatives consultant will not design, construct, or operate any future selected alternative? I think it's critical that we have confidence that the alternatives consultant will not simply propose a project that it has specific expertise or intention to construct, design, or operate. That's my first question. I think that's really important to the integrity of this entire process. My second question is, I'd like to know about conservation. Marin Municipal Water District does not have a robust program. There has the use per person in Marin County is astronomical compared to what you see in many other counties since California. That speaks to another alternative, which is decentralized water storage. Rainwater harvesting systems are an excellent example of what can be done in a county like Marin's. There is rainfall, it continues to come, although it comes in much shorter time periods. We're in a good position now specifically because we have surface water storage capacity, and those surface water reservoirs are able to fill up quickly. If we relied on groundwater, that short burst of rainfall that we had early in the season would not have been sufficient to replenish groundwater aquifers. Rainwater harvesting systems do fill up very quickly and are an excellent alternative. And that ties into conservation. Can you tell us how Marin Municipal Water District is going to weight conservation as an alternative? And finally, flexibility. Some of the previous commenters have noted future changes to climate, to water demand within the county. And I think that it's really critical that we plan to have a system that is very flexible. For example, the state is looking at direct potable reuse regulations and is going to finalize those by the end of next year. That study and the outcome of that study and those new regulations for DPR, direct potable use, that is going to completely change the water supply picture for counties like Marin. The concept of using salt water from the bay as a source of water that can then be cleaned up, i.e. desalinated and used for drinking water, makes no sense at all when recycled water is available at a much lower cost and lower carbon footprint and with a much lower and much reduced impact on the environment. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there was
Barry-
one question in there, Terry, that I could offer an answer to. I think that Jacob's expertise in operating treatment plants and other facilities will play no part in how we weight the water supply alternatives from Marin Municipal.
And Baron Hamill, please.
Thank you very much. I have two items. One, all the other Bay Area counties are connected to a state water supply system. Could our potential intertie be used to connect us to a possible future desalination plant in the San Pablo Bay so we can draw from that source rather than needing our own desal system? Second item, it was recently mentioned in a board meeting to expand the rebate programs to include residential recycling hot water systems. In that spirit of increasing conservation, when can we expect to see that implemented? And would the recirculating water rebate program, if it happens, be retroactive to a specific date, say January 1st, 2022? Sometimes these need a lot of lead time before they become a reality. Additionally, I believe that Marin Water should mandate water recirculating systems for all remodel and residential new builds so that it becomes part of our resiliency programs. And what other rebates for conservation besides gray water and turf replacement can be added to incentivize conservation? Thank you, and I appreciate your consideration of my thoughts.
Yeah, just quickly, Baron, thanks for the questions. And Carrie has just texted me and reminded me that we do offer a rebate for hot water recirculating systems. So I would connect with her group and maybe she can help you out. And then, yeah, of course, the intertie would facilitate any source of water, not local to Marin.
Okay, I'm going to pass it on back to you, Adrian.
All right. it looks like people either spoke on most of the chat questions in here. Oh, sorry, just saw a new one. Do we need an initiative to determine the goal? Wash cars, fill pools, water lawns? Can we afford those? Prorate rates to those that need to pay one level and those that want to pay another. There's sort of a question in there that might be more of a comment. I don't know if the individual Mike that typed that wants to elaborate further for the group. And if you do, you can raise your hand.
I think, is that from Jacob Stacky?
Sure. It looks like Mike has raised his hand, the one that I was reading his chat about, if he wants to first elaborate.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Stacky, or
Yep.
Can you hear me?
barely.
Answer. There seem to be a lot of misconceptions about desal, and it comes into several of the comments here. Basically in desal, you pump water and run it through a filter, you clean it. So you can use various sources. But if you think of pumping the water across the bay, that requires considerable power to do. We have here in Marin, we're blessed with 71 miles of coastline. So that is a local water supply. There's also a misconception that it uses a lot of energy. And that's the case if you do the boiling of the water, as was pretty much the only alternative 20 years ago. But with desal, you pump to a pressure, but it's not a very high pressure. It's only 85 atmospheres. I'm a scientist, so and you filter it. So the energy used in the current technology is about a half or perhaps even less than the energy that you would use by boiling the water and condensing it. You know, it takes a lot of energy to boil water. The idea of using solar, I think, is very good. We're also blessed with sunshine. And by doing it locally, we save in the transmission losses, which plague PG&E. So I wanted to ask if you can tell us where we can get a copy of the report from the solar pilot project.
Just to clarify, it was not a solar pilot project. It was a pilot program for desalination that looked at a number of issues. But yeah, we can make that available on our website.
Thanks. That'll be useful reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're gonna revisit Mike McGuire's comment. Terry, if you want to.
Yes, Mr. McGuire, hopefully you should be able to speak now.
I just thought that if we had an initiative to determine what the goal is, I mean, should the goal have the amount of water that allow people to wash cars and water lawns and fill pools? The costs for that would come out, and the public would then determine, you know, whether we wanted to incur that cost for the extra amount of water, a higher level goal, so to speak, rather than a process by people where the public has little input. Now, an initiative would be would get a lot more news than just those of us that are on a Zoom call at the moment.
I'm struggling to respond in a way that would be helpful. I don't think an initiative is needed to establish the goal. I think the goals are based on sort of a practical approach of need. And Armin talked in some of the slides this evening about the process that we'd be going through. And one of those steps is to look at what type of future hydrology, in other words, how much rainfall and runoff are we going to get in the future, and try to make some estimates of that to understand what our local supply could be. And then to look at that as a baseline and understand that under certain drought conditions, right, is it a 2-year drought that's the right drought for us to be thinking about, or is it a 6-year drought that's the right drought for us to be thinking about in terms of how much water we need? And then with some of that information, we can begin to make an assessment as to what role water use efficiency can play, and to what extent we really need to drive water use efficiency and can drive it. So I don't know, Armin, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I was about to chime in. I think the question's a very good question. And Paul articulated what we don't know is the future, and what we're trying to assess is what types of actions might be needed given certain futures. And so in the end, I think the analysis, what it will show is trade-offs of, under certain scenarios, certain actions might be needed. Under other scenarios, those actions may not be needed. And so then there is there's a trade-off process there in terms of, is it worth investing in some of those actions that have a low plausibility of occurring? And maybe the answer is yes, for redundancy and reliability and resiliency. So I think that's the part that will come in the study, and there will be lots of good discussions around that and those trade-offs that have to be made.
All right, I'll take another question from the chat here. Are containerized desal plants being considered? I've read of containerized desal operated by solar.
So the containerized desal plants operated by solar typically are very low volume production units that wouldn't be suitable for what we would need. And, we haven't done the update to the assessment, but typically a permanent desalination plant wouldn't be containerized. The containerized units present challenges in maintenance. We would construct a full-scale facility. So I don't think containerized units will feature in the analysis.
Thanks, Paul. Another question from the chat. Will the study also look at what happens to the reservoirs in case of a major wildfire, damaging at least the 5 reservoirs that are lined up in fairly close proximity?
I'm going to ask Armin to address that one, because I think he has a good answer.
Yeah, I think our scenarios right now are largely driven on kind of supply and demand aspects. We're not tasked right now to look at resiliency due to other factors. Although there is a regional resiliency study that Marin Water is part of, which is also looking at wildfires and drought and power loss to achieve regional resiliency. But this study is, because of the time frame, is fairly narrowly focused on the water supply or water management side of it.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Will there be a cost benefit provided to all the strategies or options?
Go ahead, Armin.
Yeah, the straight answer is yes. So there'll be costs associated with all of the alternative or options that we look at. And from a benefit standpoint, we'll be characterizing not just reliability and resiliency benefits, but also kind of environmental, water quality, social aspects as well. So we're in the process of developing that, and we'll be doing that as a team, but the short answer is absolutely yes.
All right, and then we had a question about the timeline, which they may have missed that earlier. When will this study be delivered?
Our time frame that we're shooting for is sort of June, July this year for sort of a draft report. Yeah.
All right, thank you. And then final question from that same person. Does sustainability factor in, and how?
Yeah, I think I'll chime in, and Paul, Lucy, feel free. The criteria that we're starting to put together when we talk about benefits will include essentially the sustainability pillars of kind of economy, environment, and social aspects. So we'll have those built in directly into our evaluation process, and that will help drive the selection of one or more or characterization of the alternatives. So great question, and absolutely. When we think of resiliency, we always think of achieving resiliency in a sustainable way, and that's what we would like to push forward here on this study as well.
Thank you. Another question, will gray water systems, home water recycling systems, rainwater harvesting systems, and recycled water truck delivery be included in the assessment?
Those features will be part of the conservation demand management side, I think. So yes, but you'll have to tune into other webinars to find out more details on some of those. As I think that's Paul Mann asking that for water champions. And I think gray water systems, there already is some form of rebate for that. And I know everyone would like that to be increased. Similarly for rainwater harvesting systems, our programs are up and running, and rebates are available if anybody wants to apply. In terms of, I think there are a couple of questions. I'm just going to capture Ms. Farnworth's question about recycled water from Las Colinas, which is a similar question to Paul Mann, who says, and recycled water truck delivery be included. So trucking of recycled water to private residences can be done, and we're working, if not have already completed, a process that will be up on our website for folks to take a look at and get some details as to how they might be able to do that. As we start to enter this sort of end of spring here, we realize that people will be interested in taking advantage of those kinds of resources.
Thank you. Terry, it looks like we got a couple more hands raised. Do we want to take some of those?
Okay. Paul Duder, then John Lashitsky, please. Mr. Duder.
Hi. So I've been looking at a lot of the desalination plants that have been done elsewhere in California. There's a plant in Carlsbad that's online. There's a plant in Huntington Beach, which is not yet online. There's a plant in Doheny, I guess. There's several others. Those plants vary quite a bit. And there's a lot of differences in those details as impacts the environment. I'm kind of wondering if we are going to just evaluate one kind of desalination plant, or are we going to look at some of those other plants and try to put together some aspects of the plant that will make it more maybe environmentally friendly. For example, in Monterey, they have a subsurface intake. Will we consider that option? Thanks.
Yeah, Paul, that's an excellent question. And, you know, as part of the team that looked at the 2005 desal pilot study here at Marin, we were very jealous of folks like Monterey and even Huntington Beach that was looking at desal back then because of their ability to have subsurface intakes. It requires a very specific geology that we just don't have in the Bay. We're not able to take advantage of it.
Mr. Lashansky?
Yeah, hi. I'd like to just another two comments. I'd like to second what Mr. Jacob Basaki said about desal plants that are, and just as was just mentioned, using boiling water and condensation. They are the most polluting solution for desal plants. You should kind of strike that from your consideration. And number two is with regard to Paul's comment, that pilot plant study that was done in 2005 addresses the very specifics of our bay water and how amenable it was to desalination. So if you can get a copy of that, I encourage everybody to read that desal report back then. And you can see how actually very positive is our system, meaning our bay system, was to that sort of treatment. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have another chat question. How much water can we regain from direct potable reuse or indirect potable reuse?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have the exact numbers in my mind, but I would add that, you know, folks indicate that both IPR, DPR, just recycled water in general, you'll hear this term drought proof. And to some extent that's true, but only to the extent that we actually have water to use in our households. So I think the volume for IPR and DPR may not be quite as much as what some folks are thinking it could be.
Paul, that will be analyzed in detail, I imagine, as part of this study, looking at.
That's right.
And the other thing that will challenge us in terms of looking at that and the costs and the scope of IPR, DPR is we don't have in the county just one large wastewater plant. That's the ideal, and you would build a facility. We have a whole number of smaller ones. And Las Galinas, for example, is using a very high percent of their water now on grade, and we're part of it, as you folks may know, for recycled for irrigation, purple pipe that's a distribution system. And we'd want to maintain that, of course, because that does offset the water supply. So we'll have the numbers, but I agree with Paul that it may not look as attractive as it may in some other areas where they have one large centralized wastewater facility that's kind of ready to go, and you just put this on the back end of the treatment system. But we'll see.
Thank you. We do have one raised hand. Ed Jamison, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the recycling issue. The 2017 study laid out all those alternatives. I thought they did a great job on the recycling, indirect versus direct, and came up with like 3,800 acre feet a year. That might provide 16% of our annual usage at a very high cost. And again, it is not drought resistant. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Right, I'm going back to a chat question from much earlier that I apologize for missing. This was posted by Larry. How will this supply development study be used to tie together with ongoing efforts to reduce water use through conservation efforts? This is understanding conservation alone cannot get us there, but is the least expensive, most efficient means of reducing water use.
I think we touched on it before with Mike McGuire's question. So the integration, right, of conservation into this water supply assessment will be a key consideration. I think until we take a look at our strategies and goals, which is the first step in the study, and then we'll be maybe better positioned to help folks, you know, characterize to what extent we're looking and counting on conservation.
Yeah, Paul, if I can add to that, if you don't mind. I think we tend to think of this as it's a water management strategy. I know we call it water supply, but we have in the scenarios that we'll be exploring, we'll have different levels of kind of baseline conservation. And then as we explore these kind of extreme droughts or more extreme droughts than what we've observed, what I anticipate is we'll be developing a strategy that looks at coupling water supply strategies with water demand strategies simultaneously. So I think it's not so much of one comes before the other, but as being strategic in how you implement both of those over time.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Leshinsky has another comment or question. Go ahead, Mr. Leshinsky.
There we go. Yeah, one more quick comment. We keep talking about treating wastewater, treating heated water, treating this, treating that we've already got as rainwater. Any place you talk about secondary water recovery, you need rainwater to start with. So going forward, you know, we got to be thinking more about conceptually making our own water and being serious about it, as opposed to praying for rain so we can clean all the wastewater we generate. It's a bit ironic. You need rainwater to make wastewater. And if you have no rainwater, then there's nothing to clean. So you got to really think hard about, particularly on the desal side, what actually size plant you need when there is no rain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Another question from the chat. How much would it cost to build a purple pipe recycled water network of pipes throughout Central Marin? Sorry.
Yeah. So we have looked at and continue to look at purple pipe projects throughout Marin, and I think every couple of years since 2000, or as I recall, we've looked at different iterations of purple pipe throughout Marin. One that sticks in my mind when we did look at Central Marin and trying to put, get as much water offset as we could. I think it's somewhere on the region of about and this is several years ago now, maybe 2017 or perhaps a little bit before that. About $100 million of pipe network that we would need to install, because it's parallel, right? It's not we can't use our drinking water pipe, and the water we would save is about, or offset in terms of potable, is about 1,800 acre feet. To put that in context for folks, our drinking water demand annually is about 26,000 acre feet.
Thank you. Great. That looks like all of the questions in the chat, and there are no more raised hands. We'll give everyone another minute in case there's any last thoughts.
I do see more hands being raised. If you guys want me to address that.
Yes,
okay.
Please take those hands. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. In this order, Steve Isaacs, then Jacob, and then Rick Adler, please. Go ahead, Mr. Isaacs, you should be unmuted.
Yes, thanks. For some reason, you don't seem to see all of the chat questions. I see a couple that have not been addressed. The last one by Mr. Gosliner.
Okay.
I think we've actually addressed that question by pointing out that this water supply assessment is going to consider the different hydrologies that we could face into the future and what our water supply options are. And those, you can't just arbitrarily select some number for storage. It needs to have some basis. And that's what we're trying to do with this water supply assessment.
Thanks, Paul. And just to be clear, I am trying not to repeat questions if they have been answered. So it's not that I'm ignoring every question in there, just trying to make sure we get through any new ones. All right, go ahead, Terry.
Mr. Jacob Stackey, you should be unmuted.
I just wanted to ask about how many miles of pipe do you operate in Marin for our water supply?
Lucy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about 900 miles of pipe.
Yep, just over 900.
Great, thanks. It's useful to think about the task that you have to deal with.
Thank you. Mr. Adler, then Mr. Roger Roberts. Go ahead, Mr. Adler.
Yes, thank you very much. I suggest that we will definitely need more water because of growth, either state mandated or natural growth. and that the new water will not necessarily come from one source, but from multiple sources. So no one source will be the solution, but various different kinds of water sources will add up to what we need. But overall, they all need electricity to run them. And the one missing part from this slides before, where we need to get our own solar power supply local, close as possible to the possible desalinization or possible water recycling plants as possible. And so I think that should be definitely considered in all these projections. And that also affects the cost too of all these projections. The bottom line will be affected by whether we're paying PG&E increasing amounts to transmit the electricity long distance, or whether we produce it locally close to the places it's needed. And also that gives us assurance that when PG&E cuts off the power, as it will, we will have power available to, move the water between the reservoirs as is done regularly, or to operate a desal plant, whatever kind it's chosen, or to recycle the water, or all the other uses that's necessary. In the bottom line, in the long run, building and owning a local couple of gigawatts of solar power will be the most efficient and most cost effective and the most stable in the long run. I thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing that in the next round of presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. And then Mr. Roger Roberts, please.
Do I have to hit the command button or not?
You're good. Just go ahead and speak, sir.
Okay. I'm sure that the studies that are going to be done by Jacobs will include analysis of operating costs and capital costs. What I don't know is whether or not they will discuss the financing arrangements that would be necessary and what the water rate increases might be, as well as address the issues of what are the risks associated with different sources of supply. I would hope that all those topics would be incorporated within whatever study is forthcoming. And forgive me if that's already been addressed. I was at another meeting and I only just signed in, and I wanted to just reinforce that point. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Roger. The studies will definitely include the costs and the risks. The means of financing may not be captured in this effort, but that would quickly come on the heels as we develop the preferred approach and begin to move forward with that.
The next two speakers, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Kenneth Gosleiner, and then Ed Jameson, please.
Okay, it's Gosliner.
Thank you.
This is actually the first time I've sat in on anything to do with the water board, although I have read a lot. I think the thing that's most upsetting to me about this meeting is the answer that we keep hearing are that as soon as the study's done, we'll have a better feeling for, how we're going to solve this problem. But I've also heard that there have been many studies over the years as far as desalinization and almost every aspect of what we're going to be looking at this time. Why should we believe that after you get done with this study, like you have with almost all the other studies, are we going to have a solution to our problem? Or are we going to just put this on the shelf like we've done all the other ones? And no matter, even when the desal plant appeared to be working out well, we still never did it because we didn't have a drought the next couple of years. The one thing we all know for sure is that we're going to have future droughts. that global warming is a fact of life that the whole world is going to have to deal with. And why can't we just come up with a solution after this study? Is that, can we depend on the board solving a problem? Because it seems to me that the worst thing that could happen is we may have too much water if we overdo this. I don't see that as a problem, or we may have too much capacity. The problem is not if we have too much or we overestimated how much we need. The problem is the shortfall. So why can we understand, how am I to understand that this study will be different than the past?
Well, I would say that from my seat as general manager, I'm seeing a very strong board commitment to respond to the signals that we're seeing due to climate change that appears to be happening far quicker than I think anyone had anticipated, to move forward and direct staff to increase the resiliency of our water supply in face of that threat. In terms of the history, I can't speak to all of it, but I would just say that I've seen a lot of work and efforts go towards developing our water recycling program, developing our conservation program. The things we don't talk enough about. We just refurbished a pump station that had been abandoned that increases our ability to obtain our allotment from Sonoma. The board's interested in looking at Phoenix Lake and being able to put in a system directly to tap that water supply. So I see a very active and engaged board and committed along what we're talking about now. And I look forward to seeing where this is going and to implement a project or a set of projects, including on the demand management side.
Thank you. Mr. Jameson, go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'd just like to suggest to Mr. Gosliner that he attends some of the board meetings, and he doesn't need to sit through the whole darn thing. There are opening comments where you can tell the board what your concerns are and what you think. You could attend for like 5 minutes and be out of there if that's all you want to do. The board, I think, needs to hear from us that we're concerned and we want creative solutions, not just conservation endlessly. We need water, there's nothing to conserve ultimately. Lastly, I'd just like to thank the district staff for once again taking a couple hours out of their evening to do their typical, really outstanding job. I'm very impressed with the quality of the people in the district staff, and I really appreciate what you're trying to do for us all, especially getting us through the last fall and winter through that very excruciating period. So a big thank you to all of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr.
We definitely appreciate that, Ed. Thank you. And really to note, it was largely our customers who responded to our call for conservation that really helped us get us through that. So thanks really to the entire community.
And we have Larry Minikis. Mr. Minikis, please.
Yeah, good evening. And I'd like to second that. Really an excellent presentation this evening. And what I think the public needs to understand is it's not just the water district that is scrambling, that has to do another study. It's everyone. It's state parks, it's national parks, it's national forests, it's the baylands, it's the oceans. It's everyone is scrambling because things are changing so quickly. So there's tonight, a lot of finger pointing that I just felt wasn't justified because everyone is scrambling. Everyone is trying to get a handle around this. And the past cannot any longer predict the future. So I just wanted to make that statement this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I don't have any raised hands.
All right. Well, I believe that brings us to the end. And Ben, do you want to offer any final words?
No, I just wanted to know, and then I start talking. But yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending and taking your time and the richness of the comments and thoughts. We heard them, we have them transcribed. and we'll be considering and integrating them to the best of our ability into the work going forward. And I think really, as the questions and comments illustrate, and as you saw, this is no small task ahead of us. And it's really going to take certainly the work of staff following the board direction. It's also going to take continued community engagement and support for the effort, support for the financial impact that may come out of this. So this is really an ongoing relationship and dialogue that we need to maintain and build upon. And that's our intention. And we look forward to continuing to do that.
All right. With that, everyone have a good evening and thank you so much. We will see you next time.
Thank you.